The package arrived on a Tuesday. Diana Blake stared at the small cardboard box on her kitchen counter, the government seal stark against the brown paper. Her fingers trembled as she reached for it. 9 years since Michael was declared dead in Syria, yet official letters still came. This one contained his watch, finally recovered from the rubble where his press convoy had been bombed. The metal was warped, the glass shattered, frozen at 10:47, the moment her husband supposedly died. It was late, too late for tears, too late for the grief that had already carved itself into the lines around her eyes, the silver strands in her once purely auburn hair, too late to change anything. Diana placed the watch beside their wedding photo and poured herself a glass of wine. After 9 years, she had built a life from the wreckage, a different life, a smaller one, but hers nonetheless. Michael Blake had been the love of her life. They met at Columbia Journalism School. He was brilliant, fearless, with eyes that crinkled at the corners when he laughed. She was methodical, cautious, more comfortable behind a desk than in the field. Opposites in temperament, but aligned in purpose. They married after graduation, built a life in Boston where she took an editor position at the Globe, while Michael chased stories across war zones and disaster areas. "Just one more assignment," he always said. "This story matters, Di." And she believed him. She always did. Syria was supposed to be his last dangerous assignment. "After this, I'll take that correspondent position in London," he promised, over their last dinner together. She'd made his favorite, lamb with rosemary potatoes. "We can start thinking about a family." He kissed her that night with an urgency she didn't understand until later. The official report said the press convoy hit an IED. 4 journalists killed instantly. No remains recovered. Just rubble and blood and scraps of the distinctive blue press vest Michael always wore. Diana remembered the military officer at her door, his face professionally blank as he delivered the news. She remembered screaming. She remembered the weeks that followed, the memorial service without a body, the condolence letters from journalists around the world, the empty side of their bed that stayed made. It had been 9 years of rebuilding, 9 years of therapy and grief support groups, and learning to say "my late husband" without her voice breaking. She'd sold their Boston brownstone, moved to a smaller place in Cambridge, changed jobs, started traveling, not to war zones, but to quiet places, New Zealand fjords, Japanese forests, Icelandic lagoons, places where Michael had never been, places that could be hers alone. And now, this watch. This remnant from a life she had packed away, arriving like a ghost to remind her of everything she'd lost. Diana emptied her wine glass and opened her laptop. She had made it a ritual, every year on the anniversary of Michael's death, to look through their photos, to read his published articles, to remember the man she loved, not just the hole he left behind. The watch's arrival had triggered this ritual early. She clicked through folders of digital memories, their honeymoon in Greece, Christmas with her parents, his 30th birthday party. Michael always in motion, always leaning toward the camera, as if he couldn't wait to see what happened next. She logged into his old email account, which she'd kept active all these years, a digital shrine of sorts. Nothing new, of course, just the same old messages, interview requests he'd never answer, newsletters he'd never read. Diana was about to close the laptop when a notification appeared in the corner of her screen. Instagram. A suggestion of people you may know. She rarely used social media anymore, but had kept accounts active, something to do with feeling connected to the world. The algorithm occasionally sent her these notifications, usually suggesting colleagues or distant acquaintances, but this time, the small circular profile photo made her heart stop. It couldn't be. It was impossible. The username was different, a Cairo chronicler, but the profile photo showed a man with his back to the camera, looking out over the pyramids at Giza, a man with the same set to his shoulders that Michael had, the same cowlick at the back of his head that never laid flat. Her hand shook as she clicked on the profile. It was private. The bio simply read, "Documenting life along the Nile, photography and observations." The location, Cairo, Egypt. Diana's throat closed. Michael had always wanted to work in Egypt, had talked about the history, the politics, the food. "Someday," he'd said, "we'll spend a year in Cairo." She requested to follow the account, then immediately regretted it. This was madness. This wasn't Michael. Michael was dead. She had grieved him, buried him, if only symbolically. This was some stranger whose profile photo had triggered her grief, nothing more. But that cowlick, those shoulders, sleep didn't come that night. Diana lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the watch on her nightstand ticking impossibly, though its hands remained fixed at 10:47. By morning she had convinced herself it was nothing, a coincidence, her mind playing tricks, until she checked her phone. A Cairo chronicler had accepted her follow request, and there they were, dozens of photos, desert landscapes, narrow Cairo streets, close-ups of food in local restaurants, no selfies, no clear photos of the photographer, just glimpses, a shadow, a reflection in a shop window, a hand holding a cup of tea. But Diana knew those hands, had held them, had felt them on her skin for 7 years of marriage. She scrolled frantically, looking for proof, for certainty. Most posts had no captions or just simple observations about the scene photographed. But then she found it. A photo of the Nile at sunset posted 3 years ago with a caption that read, "The river flows on, regardless of what has been lost along its banks." It was a line from Michael's favorite poem. Diana's phone clattered to the floor. The room spun around her. This couldn't be happening. Her husband was dead. She had a death certificate, had received condolences from the president, had scattered symbolic ashes in the Charles River, yet here was this account, these photos, that line of poetry. It was late afternoon before Diana could think clearly again. She picked up her phone, hands steady now with determination rather than shock. She studied every photo, every caption. There was nothing explicitly identifying, nothing that said, "I am Michael Blake, war correspondent presumed dead in Syria." But there were hints. A photo of a bookshelf that included authors Michael had loved, a shot of a coffee shop that served the specific Ethiopian blend he favored. Diana created a new email account, sent a message to the address listed in the Instagram bio. "I know it's you," she wrote, nothing else. Then she waited. 3 days passed. Diana called in sick to work. She barely ate, barely slept. She found herself standing in front of the mirror, studying her changed face. The lines time had added. The hardness grief had carved around her mouth. Would he even recognize her now? If it was him. If her husband hadn't died but had chosen to disappear, had chosen to leave her behind. On the 4th day, a reply came. "I don't know what you're talking about." 5 words. Non-committal. A denial that denied nothing specific. Diana typed back immediately. The watch stopped at 10:47. They just found it in the rubble after all these years. She sent it before she could second-guess herself, before she could consider that she might be messaging a stranger, might be revealing her vulnerability to someone who would use it against her. This time the reply came within minutes. "Diana, don't." Her name. Her name in a message from a man using the handle Cairo Chronicler. A man who had her husband's cowlick and hands and taste in poetry. "Don't what?" she typed back, fingers trembling so badly she had to correct multiple typos. "Don't ask why my dead husband is posting photos from Egypt. Don't wonder why you let me think you were dead for 9 years. She hit send, then threw the phone across the room as if it had burned her. It clattered against the wall, screen miraculously unbroken. When she retrieved it an hour later, there was a new message. It wasn't safe. For either of us. Diana stared at the words until they blurred. Not safe. What did that mean? What could possibly justify letting her believe he was dead? Letting her grieve, suffer, rebuild her life around a hole the exact shape of him? "Explain," she replied. 1 word. A command. "Not over email," came the response. "Not over the phone. If you want answers, you'll have to come to Cairo. Cairo, halfway across the world. To meet a man who might be her husband, who might be a cruel prankster, who might be dangerous." "How do I know this is real?" she asked. "How do I know you're really Michael?" The reply took longer this time. When it came, it was a single sentence. "On our honeymoon in Santorini, you got sunburned so badly on your left shoulder that the scar still looks like the continent of Australia." Diana's breath caught. The sunburn. The scar. She reached up to touch her left shoulder through her shirt, feeling the slightly raised skin there. No one knew about that except Michael. She'd always been too embarrassed to wear tank tops that showed it, hated that she'd been so careless with sunscreen on their honeymoon of all times. "Michael," she whispered into the empty room, "you're alive." The ticket to Cairo cost more than Diana could comfortably afford, but she bought it anyway. First class. If she was flying to meet a ghost, she might as well be comfortable. She told her boss she needed personal leave, a family emergency, not entirely a lie. She told her neighbor to water her plants, her friend Sarah to check her mail. She told no one where she was really going or why. What would she even say? My dead husband might actually be alive in Egypt, so I'm going to check. They'd think she'd lost her mind. Maybe she had. The flight was long. Diana alternated between sleep, terrible airplane food, and staring at the messages from a Cairo chronicler. She'd asked for more proof, and he'd provided it. Details only Michael would know. The name of their first pet fish. The weird thing she always said in her sleep that he used to tease her about. The exact place on her lower back that made her gasp when touched. She'd asked why. Why fake his death? Why stay away so long? Why contact her now? But he'd refused to explain until they met in person. Some things can't be written down, he'd said. Some things are still dangerous. The plane began its descent into Cairo International. Diana looked out the window at the sprawling city below, the ribbon of the Nile cutting through it. Somewhere down there was Michael, her husband, the man she had mourned and missed, and eventually moved past. What would she feel when she saw him? Rage, joy, love? Nothing at all. The meeting place was a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. Less crowded, he'd explained. Safer. That word again. Safer. What was he afraid of after all this time? Diana took a taxi from her hotel, watching the busy Cairo streets pass by. She wore sunglasses and a light scarf over her hair, not for cultural reasons, but because she suddenly felt the need for some disguise, some barrier between herself and whatever awaited her. The cafe was nearly empty when she arrived, just an old man reading a newspaper and a young couple huddled over coffee. No Michael. She chose a table in the corner, back to the wall, facing the door. Ordered mint tea she didn't want just to have something to do with her hands, and then the door opened. He was thinner, tanned from the Egyptian sun. His dark hair had threads of silver at the temples, and he'd grown a short beard that was more salt than pepper. But his eyes, those were the same deep brown that had looked at her across their dinner table for 7 years. The same eyes she had seen in her dreams for 9 years after. Michael Blake, her husband, alive. He saw her immediately, his step faltering for just a moment before he crossed to her table. He didn't try to embrace her, didn't reach for her hand, just pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "Diana," he said, and his voice was exactly as she remembered it. "Thank you for coming." She had imagined this moment 1,000 times on the flight over, had rehearsed what she would say, what she would ask, but sitting across from this ghost made flesh all her prepared words dissolved. "You bastard," she whispered instead. 9 years. He nodded, accepting this. I know what I did to you." "Do you?" Her voice rose slightly and she forced it back down. "Do you know what it's like to have officers at your door telling you your husband is dead, to plan a memorial service, to go to grief counseling for years, to finally start to heal, only to find out it was all a lie?" Michael's eyes dropped to the table. "I can imagine, but I can't truly know. And I'm sorry, more than I can ever express." "Why?" Diana demanded, the single question that had burned in her since seeing that Instagram profile. "Why did you do it?" He looked around the cafe, some old wariness still in his movements. "It's complicated." "Uncomplicated," she snapped. "You owe me that much." Michael sighed, rubbed a hand over his bearded face. "The story I was working on in Syria, it wasn't what I told you it was. It wasn't about civilian casualties or refugee movements." Diana felt cold, despite the Cairo heat. "What was it about?" "Arms dealing. Specifically American-made weapons being sold illegally to militant groups. I had evidence, names, documentation of who was selling, who was buying, who was profiting. And they found out." His voice was flat. "The convoy bombing wasn't random, it was targeted. They were trying to kill me, destroy my evidence." Diana stared at him. "But the other journalists?" 4 people died." Pain flashed across his face. Three died. I was thrown clear somehow. Woke up in the rubble with a concussion and broken ribs. The others were—" He swallowed hard. "They were gone, and I knew immediately that it wasn't an accident." "So you ran," Diana said, the pieces fitting together. "You let everyone think you died in the bombing and you ran." He nodded. "I had a contact, someone who'd been helping with my investigation. They got me out of Syria, gave me a new identity. I ended up in Lebanon first, then Jordan, then finally Egypt. But why not come home? Why not come back to me? The question that had haunted her since that Instagram notification. Why let me think you were dead for 9 years? Michael reached across the table then as if to take her hand, but stopped when she flinched away. Because they would have killed you too, he said quietly. The people I was investigating, they're powerful, connected. They don't just stop if they think someone has evidence against them. They would have watched you thinking I might make contact. They would have used you to get to me. That doesn't explain 9 years, Diana insisted. Maybe the first year, maybe 2, but 9. And why reveal yourself now? Why that Instagram account that could be traced? The Instagram account was a mistake, he admitted. A moment of weakness. After 7 years here, I thought maybe it was safe, that they'd forgotten about me, moved on. I was careful. No selfies, no real name, nothing that explicitly connected to my old life. Just hints, things that only you might recognize. You wanted me to find you, Diana realized. You were leaving breadcrumbs. He nodded, looking miserable. I missed you. Every day. I missed you. I told myself it was better for you to think I was dead than to live in fear, always looking over your shoulder. But the truth is, I was a coward. It was easier to stay dead than to face what I'd done to you. Diana felt tears threatening and blinked them back hard. She wouldn't cry. Not now. And now? Why is it suddenly safe to meet? What changed? The evidence I had. I finally found the right people to give it to. Journalists I trust. Lawyers with international connections. The story broke 3 months ago. Diana frowned. What story? American arms dealers linked to Syrian war crimes, he quoted. It didn't make huge headlines in the US. These things rarely do. But internationally, it caused waves. Arrests were made. The main players are facing charges at The Hague. I don't understand, Diana said slowly. You had this evidence 9 years ago. Why wait so long to release it? Michael's face darkened. Because it wasn't complete. The bombing destroyed most of what I had. I've spent 9 years rebuilding the case, finding new sources, connecting new dots. I couldn't come back until it was done. Until it was safe. Safe. That word again. Diana wanted to laugh hysterically. Safe for whom? Not for her heart, certainly. Not for the life they might have had. So now what? She asked instead. You've built a life here. I've built a life there. 9 years, Michael. We're different people now. I know, he said softly. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect us to pick up where we left off. I needed you to know the truth. I needed to see you one more time. Diana looked at this man across from her, this stranger with her husband's eyes. She had loved him once, completely, had grieved him completely too. I remarried, she said suddenly. A lie, a test. Pain flashed across his face, but he nodded. I hoped you would, that you'd find happiness again. The lie dissolved on her tongue, leaving bitterness behind. I didn't actually, but I considered it. There was someone, a few years ago, but I couldn't. Something held me back. She laughed humorlessly. I guess some part of me knew. Diana? No, she cut him off. Don't apologize again. Don't tell me how sorry you are. Actions have consequences, Michael. You chose to stay away. You chose to let me grieve. You'll have to live with that choice. He nodded, accepting her anger. What happens now? He asked quietly. What do you want to happen? Diana looked around the small cafe, at the life Michael had built without her, at the city he'd chosen over her. What did she want? To scream at him, to hit him, to fall into his arms and pretend the last 9 years never happened? I don't know, she admitted finally. I came here for answers. I got them, but I don't know what to do with them. Will you stay? He asked. In Cairo, I mean, for a few days. We could talk more. I could show you my life here. The presumption of it stung, that she would want to see the life he'd built while she suffered. But curiosity won out over pride. A few days, she agreed, but I'm not promising anything. I'm not promising forgiveness or understanding or anything else. That's fair, Michael said. More than fair, his expression seemed to say. Thank you. They left the cafe together, stepping into the hot Cairo afternoon. Diana felt untethered, as if she might float away from the sidewalk, from reality itself. Her dead husband walked beside her, alive and breathing and so achingly familiar despite everything. It was too late to go back to how things were, too late to undo the years of grief and rebuilding, too late for the children they might have had, for the life they'd planned in London, for the simple trust that had once existed between them. But perhaps, and it was a fragile, dangerous perhaps it wasn't too late for something new to begin. The next 3 days passed in a strange limbo. Michael showed Diana his Cairo, the hidden cafes, the quiet corners of famous museums, the rooftop where he often photographed sunsets over the city. He introduced her to his friends, mostly other expatriates, a few local Egyptians who spoke excellent English. He showed her his small apartment with its balcony overlooking a busy street market. Diana observed it all with detached interest, as if watching a film about someone else's life. This was the world her husband had chosen over her. These were the people who knew him while she grieved him. They talked cautiously at first, then with increasing honesty. Michael told her about his first years in hiding, the paranoia, the nightmares, the constant fear of discovery. He told her how he'd rebuilt his investigation, piece by painstaking piece, making connections with sources who risked their lives to provide information. "I thought about contacting you," he admitted one night as they sat on his balcony, the sounds of Cairo rising around them. "So many times, especially at first. I'd write emails I never sent. I'd pick up burner phones and dial your number, then hang up before it connected." "I wish you had," Diana said quietly. "Even if it was dangerous, even if we could never be together again. Just to know you were alive would have changed everything." "Would it have been kinder?" he asked. "To know I was alive but couldn't be with you? To live in fear that people might be watching you, following you just to get to me? I truly believed that a clean break was better, that grieving and moving on would hurt less in the long run." Diana considered this. Would it have been better? To know he lived but could never come home? To wait endlessly, suspended between loss and hope? "I don't know," she admitted. "But it should have been my choice. You took that from me." He nodded, accepting this truth. "I did, and I'll never stop being sorry for that." On the 4th day, Diana's last in Cairo before her return flight, they visited the pyramids. Tourist sites weren't Michael's usual preference, too crowded, too many cameras. But Diana had insisted, if this was to be their last day together, she wanted something memorable, something significant. They stood in the shadow of the Great Pyramid, surrounded by tourists and vendors and camels for hire. Diana felt small beneath the ancient stones, her problems suddenly insignificant against their timeless presence. "What happens after I leave?" she asked suddenly, turning to Michael. "Do you stay here? Do you keep living as Cairo chronicler?" He looked surprised by the question. I don't know. The danger is mostly past now. The main players are facing prosecution. I could potentially come home." Home. The word hung between them. What was home now? Where? With whom? "And if you did," Diana pressed, "what then? Would you expect to pick up where we left off? Would you move back into my life as if you'd just been away on a long assignment?" Michael shook his head. "No, I know too much has happened. Too much time has passed. You've built a life without me, and I've built one without you. I wouldn't expect anything. Then why come back at all?" The question that had been forming since she'd confirmed he was alive. He was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the desert beyond the pyramids. "Because America is still my home," he said finally. "Because despite everything, I miss it. And because I need to face what I did. The consequences. I can't hide forever." Diana nodded. It was the right answer, the honest one. Not because of her, not to win her back or reclaim what they'd had, but because it was time to stop running. "If you do come back," she said carefully, "I can't promise what will happen. Between us, I mean. I don't know if I can forgive you yet. I don't know if we can build something new from these ruins." "I understand," he said. And he did. She could see it in his eyes. The resignation, the acceptance that his choices had irrevocably changed everything. "But," Diana continued, surprising herself with the words even as they left her mouth, "I'd be willing to find out. Slowly. Carefully. With no expectations." Michael's eyes widened. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying I spent 9 years loving a ghost," Diana interrupted. "I'm curious to see if I could learn to love the man instead." It wasn't a promise. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was an opening, a small window left unlocked in a house he'd been locked out of for 9 years. "I'd like that," he said simply, "the chance to find out." They stood there in the shadow of monuments that had witnessed thousands of years of human joy and suffering, of separations and reunions. Two people, who had once known everything about each other, now carefully navigating the strangers they'd become. Diana's flight left the next morning. Michael drove her to the airport, the car ride mostly silent. What was there left to say that hadn't been said? What promises could be made when the future remained so uncertain? At the departures terminal, they faced each other awkwardly. Not quite strangers anymore, but not quite anything else defined. "I'll be in touch," Michael said, "about my plans to return, if that's okay." Diana nodded. "It's okay." He hesitated, then reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, he wrapped his arms around her in a careful embrace. Diana stood stiffly for a moment, then allowed herself to relax against him. He smelled different. Unfamiliar soap, unfamiliar laundry detergent. But underneath was something her body remembered, something that made her heart ache with recognition. "Goodbye, Diana," he whispered against her hair. "Goodbye, Michael," she replied, then pulled away and walked into the terminal without looking back. On the plane, watching Cairo shrink beneath her, Diana tried to process everything that had happened. Her dead husband was alive. He had chosen to let her believe he was dead. He had built a life without her. And now, maybe, he would return to build a new life that might or might not include her. It was too much to comprehend all at once. Too much to feel. She closed her eyes, leaning back in her seat. There would be time to sort through it all. Time to decide what she wanted. Time to determine if the man Michael had become was someone she could love, or even just forgive. For now it was enough to know the truth. Enough to know that the frozen watch on her nightstand, stopped eternally at 10:47, had been a lie. Time hadn't stopped for Michael Blake. It had continued, carrying him away from her to a new life in Egypt while she remained trapped in grief. But now time could move forward for her too. Whatever happened next, whether they found each other again or remained forever separated by the choices he'd made, Diana was no longer waiting for a ghost, no longer living in the shadow of a tragedy that never happened. It was too late for the life they'd planned together, too late for the simple happiness they might have had, but perhaps not too late for something else, something new, something true. Diana fastened her seatbelt as the plane began its ascent toward home, toward an uncertain future, toward whatever came next. 6 months later, Diana stood in the international arrivals area of Boston Logan Airport. After countless video calls, emails, and careful negotiations, Michael was finally coming home. Not to her home, they both agreed that would be too much, too soon, but to a small apartment he'd rented in Jamaica Plain, close enough to see each other regularly, far enough to maintain their separate lives. She hadn't told anyone the full truth yet, had just said that there had been a mistake, that Michael hadn't died in the bombing but had been injured, had lost his memory, had been living under a different name in Egypt. It was easier than explaining the real story, easier than admitting she'd been married to a man capable of such deception, even if his motives were protection rather than cruelty. Her heart pounded as passengers began streaming through the arrival gates. What if she'd made a mistake? What if forgiveness was impossible? What if the tentative reconnection they'd built over 6 months of careful communication collapsed under the weight of reality? And then he was there, Michael Blake, her husband, the ghost made flesh. He looked different in Boston somehow, more like the man she remembered, less like the stranger in Cairo. He'd shaved the beard, cut his hair shorter. He looked both younger and older than he had in Egypt. He spotted her, his step faltering slightly before he continued forward. They'd agreed no grand gestures, no running into each other's arms. This wasn't a movie reunion. This was real life, complicated and messy, and still so fragile. "Hi," he said simply when he reached her. "Hi," Diana replied. "Welcome home." It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There would be hard conversations ahead, moments of doubt, perhaps even the eventual realization that too much had been broken to fully repair. But as they walked together toward the exit, not touching but side by side, Diana felt something she hadn't expected. Hope. Not for a return to what was, but for the possibility of what might be. The watch that had stopped at 10:47 still sat on her nightstand. A reminder not of death now, but of the curious nature of time, how it could seem to stop in moments of great pain, yet continue inexorably forward, carrying all of us toward unknown futures. It was too late for the past, but the present stretched before them, full of possibility. And that perhaps was enough. "I never stopped loving you," Michael said quietly as they stepped into the Boston spring sunshine. Diana looked at him. This familiar stranger, this man she had loved and lost and found again in the most impossible way. "I know," she said simply. "That's why we're here. Not a promise, not forgiveness, not yet, but a beginning. And after 9 years of endings, a beginning was everything. He never meant to come back." That was the truth Diana finally understood 1 year after Michael's return to Boston. He never intended to be found. The Instagram account hadn't been breadcrumbs deliberately left for her to follow. It had been a moment of weakness, a small rebellion against his self-imposed exile, a tiny window through which she had accidentally glimpsed him, recognized him, reclaimed him. They sat on the bench overlooking the Charles River, the October air crisp around them. A year of careful reconstruction, a year of therapy, both individual and together. A year of learning each other again, of discovering the people they'd become in the 9 years of separation. "If I hadn't found that Instagram account," Diana said, watching a rowing team glide across the water, "would you ever have revealed yourself? Ever come home?" Michael was quiet for a long moment, his hand not quite touching hers on the bench between them. "I don't know," he finally admitted. "I told myself I was waiting until it was completely safe, until the story was published and the perpetrators facing justice. But the truth is I was afraid." "Of what?" "Of this," he gestured between them, "of facing what I'd done to you, of seeing the pain I'd caused. It was easier to stay dead than to witness the consequences of my choice." It hurt to hear, but Diana appreciated his honesty. They'd promised that to each other. Complete truth, no matter how painful. It was the only way forward. "So, finding you was an accident," she mused. "A 1,000,000 to 1 chance." "Not entirely," Michael said. "I named the account something you might search for if you were looking. I posted that line from the poem we both loved. Some part of me was reaching out, even if I wasn't brave enough to do it directly." Diana nodded. She understood that now, how we can want and fear the same thing simultaneously, how we can take tiny steps toward what we desire while convincing ourselves we're standing still. "I'm glad I found you," she said after a moment. "Even with all the pain, all the complications, I'm glad to know the truth." Michael's hand moved then, covering hers on the bench, a simple touch they no longer took for granted. "I'm glad too," he said softly. "Coming home was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was the right thing." They weren't living together yet, weren't ready for that step, but they had dinner together 3 times a week, went to movies, to museums, to quiet restaurants where they could talk. They were dating, essentially, learning each other as the people they were now, not the memories of who they'd been. Some days were easier than others. Some days Diana looked at Michael and felt nothing but love, nothing but gratitude for this impossible second chance. Other days the anger would return, sharp and sudden as a paper cut, and she would need space, need distance from the man who had let her believe he was dead for 9 long years. Michael accepted these oscillations with a patience he hadn't possessed before. The Michael she'd married had been restless, always chasing the next story, the next adrenaline rush. This Michael moved more deliberately, thought before he spoke, waited rather than pushed. 9 years in hiding had changed him, just as 9 years of grief had changed her. "What are you thinking about?" Michael asked, watching her face. Diana turned to him, studying the new lines around his eyes, the silver at his temples that hadn't been there before. "I'm thinking about time," she said, "about how much of it we lost and how precious what remains is." He nodded, understanding. They were in their 40s now. The family they'd once planned to start was likely an impossibility. The carefree years of early marriage were behind them. What they had now was more complex, tempered by experience and pain and loss. "Do you ever wonder," Diana asked, "what would have happened if you'd made a different choice? If you'd come to me after the bombing, told me the truth, let me decide whether to go into hiding with you?" Michael looked out over the water, his profile sharp against the autumn light. "Every day," he admitted. "I lie awake at night sometimes, constructing alternate versions of our lives. Versions where we fled together, built new identities together. Versions where I brought you the danger rather than protecting you from it." "That should have been my choice," Diana said, the familiar refrain of their ongoing conversation. Not an accusation anymore, just a statement of fact. "I know," he said simply, "my greatest regret." They sat in silence for a while, watching the light change on the water. This was their rhythm now. Moments of connection followed by comfortable silence, followed by difficult truths, followed by healing. "I have something to tell you," Michael said finally. "I've been offered a position. Teaching journalism ethics and war correspondence at Northeastern." Diana turned to him, surprised. "You're considering teaching?" He nodded. "The reporting life, I don't think I can go back to it. Too many ghosts. Too many reminders." He paused. "And I don't want to leave again. Not now. Not when we're finding our way. Finding our way." A careful phrase for this delicate reconstruction they were attempting. Not rebuilding what was lost, that was impossible, but creating something new from the scattered pieces. "I think you'd be a good teacher," Diana said thoughtfully. "You have experiences most journalism professors never will, perspective they can't offer." "That's what the dean said." Michael smiled slightly. "Apparently faking your own death for 9 years while investigating international arms dealers gives you unique qualifications." Diana laughed despite herself. They could joke about it now, sometimes, not often, but occasionally. Small moments of lightness in the heavy narrative of their reunited lives. "Will you take it?" she asked. Michael looked at her, his expression serious again. "I wanted to ask what you thought first. It would mean staying in Boston long term. It would mean committing to being here, to seeing if we can make this work." Diana felt something expand in her chest. Not quite hope, not quite fear, something in between. "I think," she said carefully, "that I would like you to stay. I think we've lost enough time already." He reached for her hand again, held it a little tighter. "Then I'll stay." It wasn't a declaration of undying love. It wasn't a promise that everything would be perfect. But it was a commitment to try, to stay, to face whatever came next together rather than apart. As they walked back toward Diana's apartment, Michael would come up for coffee, would leave before dinner, the careful boundaries they'd established. Diana thought about the watch. The broken watch that had arrived on her doorstep a year ago, hands frozen at 10:47. The physical embodiment of time stopped, of a life interrupted. She had put it away last week, finally. Removed it from her nightstand, and placed it in a box of keepsakes in her closet. Not forgotten, but no longer central. No longer the first thing she saw each morning and the last thing she saw each night. Time hadn't stopped at 10:47 that day in Syria. It had continued, carrying them in separate directions for 9 long years before bringing them back together, changed but still recognizable to each other. And now time moved forward for both of them, together. Uncertain, but full of possibility. It was too late for what might have been, but perhaps, just perhaps, it wasn't too late for what still could be. The official story they told the world was simpler than the truth. Michael Blake, award-winning war correspondent, had not died in that bombing in Syria. He had been injured, had suffered memory loss, had been taken in by local people who didn't know his identity. He had built a new life in Egypt under a different name, and then, miraculously, his memory had returned. He had reached out to his wife, had come home. It was the story they told Diana's friends, Michael's surviving family, the colleagues who welcomed him back with astonishment and joy. It was the story that appeared in a small article in the Boston Globe, more human interest than hard news. Local journalist returns from the dead after 9 years. Only 4 people knew the full truth: Diana, Michael, his therapist, and the lawyer who had helped him navigate the complex legal issues of returning from the dead. His death certificate rescinded, his assets reclaimed, his identity legally restored. "Do you think people believe it?" Diana asked one evening, 6 months after Michael had taken the teaching position at Northeastern. They were cooking dinner together in her apartment. A new step in their careful reconciliation. "The amnesia story?" Michael stirred the pasta sauce, considering. "I think they want to believe it," he said finally. "It's neater, more comfortable, and it lets everyone off the hook. Me for staying away, you for not recognizing me sooner, the government for declaring me dead. Everyone gets to be blameless in that version." Diana nodded, chopping herbs with precise movements. They had settled into a rhythm these past months. Dinner together 3 times a week, sometimes at his apartment, sometimes at hers. Sometimes they cooked, sometimes they ordered in, building new patterns, new memories. "Your students seem to like you," she observed, changing the subject. She'd attended one of his lectures the previous week, sitting in the back of the hall, watching this new version of Michael in his element. He was good with the students, patient, insightful, drawing on his experiences without sensationalizing them. "They're curious," he smiled, "especially about Syria. I think they're hoping I'll slip up and reveal that the amnesia story is fiction. And have you? Diana raised an eyebrow. Slipped up? No. Michael shook his head. But I don't lie to them either. I focus on the ethics, on the responsibilities journalists have to their sources, to the truth to the public, and to themselves and their loved ones. He looked at her meaningfully. I teach them about consequences. Diana met his gaze across the kitchen counter. They had come so far in the past year and a half, from strangers in a Cairo cafe to this, cooking dinner together on a Tuesday night, talking about his students, about ordinary things, the extraordinary circumstances of their reunion fading slowly into the background of their everyday lives. Not forgotten, never forgotten, but no longer the only thing defining them. I was thinking, Diana said carefully, sprinkling the chopped herbs into the salad, that maybe it's time to revisit our living situation. Michael stilled, wooden spoon hovering over the saucepan. What do you mean? I mean, Diana took a deep breath, that maybe we could consider living together again. Not right away. Maybe we start with you staying over sometimes. See how it feels. They hadn't spent a full night together since his return. Physical intimacy had come tentatively months earlier, familiar and foreign all at once, their bodies remembering what their minds still struggled to reconcile. But afterward, one of them always went home, always maintained that final boundary. Are you sure? Michael asked, his voice carefully neutral, not pushing, not assuming. This new Michael, who had learned patience in the hardest possible way. Diana considered the question. Was she sure? No, she wasn't sure of anything anymore. Life had taught her that certainty was an illusion, that everything you believed to be true could change in an instant. I'm not sure, she admitted, but I want to find out. I think it's time to find out. Michael nodded slowly. Then we'll find out. Together, together. Such a simple word for such a complex reality. They were not the same people who had built a life together before. Diana was no longer the cautious editor, Michael no longer the reckless correspondent. They had both been tempered by their separate sufferings, shaped by years spent apart. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps they needed to become these different people to find each other again. Perhaps the Michael and Diana who had married young and bright and certain would never have found their way back to each other across such a breach. The sauce is burning, Diana pointed out, breaking the moment. Michael laughed, turning back to the stove. So it is. They moved around each other in the kitchen, adjusting, accommodating, finding their rhythm. Not the easy synchronicity of their early marriage, but something more deliberate, more mindful. Later, after dinner, they sat on Diana's small balcony, watching the city lights. Michael's hand rested lightly on hers, a casual touch that no longer felt like a miracle or a mirage, but simply like comfort, like connection. Do you think, he asked quietly, that we would have found each other again if you hadn't seen that Instagram profile, if coincidence hadn't brought us back together? Diana considered the question. The Diana of 2 years ago would have said no, would have believed in the finality of death, in the impossibility of such a reunion. But now, I think, she said slowly, that some part of me always knew you weren't really gone, not because of any mystical connection or sixth sense. Just, there was always something unresolved, something that kept me from fully moving on. Michael nodded. For me too. Even when I was convinced staying away was protecting you, there was always this pull, this sense that the story wasn't finished. And now? Diana turned to look at him, this familiar stranger who was becoming familiar again in new ways. Does the story feel finished now? He smiled, the expression softening the lines that 9 years of exile had carved into his face. No, he said simply. It feels like it's finally beginning. Diana leaned her head against his shoulder, allowing herself this moment of peace, of possibility. They had lost so much time, had suffered separately when they might have faced their challenges together. But perhaps that was their story, finding each other not once but twice, learning each other not once but twice. Stay tonight, she said softly, not a question. Michael's arm tightened around her shoulders. I'll stay. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. The past still rose between them sometimes, sharp and painful as broken glass. There were still moments when Diana looked at Michael and felt the echo of that devastating grief, that sense of abandonment. Still moments when Michael retreated into himself, haunted by his choices and their consequences. But more and more, there were other moments, moments of connection, of understanding, of a love that had been tested by the most extreme circumstances and had somehow improbably endured. It was too late for the life they had planned, too late for the simple happiness they might have had, but it wasn't too late for this, for a second chance, for a new beginning, for a love story unlike any other. Time continued its relentless forward movement, carrying them with it, not backward to what was lost, but forward to what might still be found. Together, 2 years after Michael's return to Boston, they stood together on a beach in Santorini, the same beach where they had spent their honeymoon 15 years earlier, the same beach where Diana had gotten the terrible sunburn that left the Australia-shaped scar on her left shoulder. They weren't here to recapture the past. They had learned the impossibility of that. They were here to create something new, something that acknowledged the past without being imprisoned by it. "I never thought I'd see this place again," Michael said, looking out over the impossibly blue water. He looked more like himself now, the beard grown back but neatly trimmed, his body filled out again after the thinness of his Cairo years. He looked settled in a way he never had before. "Neither did I," Diana admitted. She had avoided places they'd visited together during the 9 years she believed him dead. Too many ghosts, too many memories. But now, with Michael beside her, the memories felt different, not poisoned by grief but transformed by their improbable reunion. They had married again 6 months earlier. A small ceremony, just the two of them, and a judge, not because their original marriage wasn't legally valid. It was once Michael's death certificate was rescinded, but because they wanted to choose each other again, to make promises with full knowledge of how fragile and precious those promises were. Diana Blake and Michael Blake. The same names, the same people, but a different marriage. One built on the ruins of the first, stronger for having weathered the collapse. "I have something for you," Michael said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small box, not a jewelry box, but something older, made of worn leather. Diana took it, curious, opened it to find a watch. Not the broken watch that had been recovered from the bombing, but a new one. Simple, elegant, clearly expensive. "Turn it over," Michael said quietly. Diana did. On the back was an inscription, "Time lost, time found." "Michael," she breathed, running her finger over the engraved words. "I wanted to give you something to replace that broken watch," he explained. "Something that represents not the time we lost, but the time we've found again. The time we still have." Diana felt tears prick her eyes. They came more easily now, these moments of emotion. She had spent so many years carefully controlled, carefully restrained, keeping her grief in check. Now she allowed herself to feel everything, the joy and the sorrow, the anger and the forgiveness, the past and the present. "It's beautiful," she said, fastening the watch around her wrist. "Thank you." They stood together watching the sunset over the Aegean, the same sun that had set over this same sea when they were younger, less broken, less wise. Diana felt Michael's hand find hers, their fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity they had rediscovered. It hadn't been easy these past 2 years. There had been setbacks, arguments, moments when the weight of the past threatened to crush this fragile new thing they were building. But they had persevered, had committed to the hard work of forgiveness, of trust, rebuilt piece by painstaking piece, of love rekindled not in spite of, but because of all they had endured. "What are you thinking?" Michael asked, watching her face in the fading light. Diana looked at him, this man she had loved and lost and found again against all odds, this man who had made a terrible choice with the best of intentions, this man who had found the courage to come back, to face the consequences, to begin again. "I'm thinking about time," she said, echoing the conversation they'd had by the Charles River 2 years earlier, about how it's never too late to start again. Michael smiled, bringing their joined hands to his lips. "Never too late," he agreed, "not for us." As the sun disappeared below the horizon, Diana felt something settle within her. The grief and anger that had been her companions for so long had not vanished completely, they never would, but they had transformed into something else, something that could coexist with joy, with hope, with the love she had found again. The watch on her wrist ticked steadily forward, not frozen at 10:47, the moment everything had shattered, but moving, always moving into the future they were creating together. It was too late for what might have been, but it wasn't too late for what was, for this moment on a Santorini beach, for the life they were building now day by careful day, Not the life they had planned, something different, something harder won, something perhaps even more precious for having been so nearly lost. Time lost, time found. And in the finding, something extraordinary. A love story unlike any other. A second chance that defied all odds. Diana Blake and Michael Blake. The same names, different people, a different love, a different life, but theirs. Finally, completely, theirs. Together.